Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. While many today regret their loss, during the 20th century right across New South Wales, it was very common to completely remove or convert to other purposes old or disused cemeteries. The valuable land they covered was then put to what was considered better use. Newcastle had 6 of these cemeteries: the Presbyterian, Roman Catholic and Wesleyan Methodist burial grounds in Newcastle West, the First Wallsend Cemetery, now known as Old Wallsend, the cemetery attached to St Andrew's Church of England in North Waratah, and Newcastle's earliest burial ground at Christchurch. In this Lost Cemeteries series, Jane Ison outlines the work of the Newcastle Family History Society researchers and what they have been able to uncover about where the cemeteries were, their history, what happened to the monuments originally standing within them, and those who are buried there. In the 4th podcast in the series, Jane looks at the Presbyterian Cemetery, once situated beside Cottage Creek in Newcastle West.
It is important for listeners to understand that there was not one Newcastle West cemetery. There were, in fact, 3 separate burial grounds in the general area of Newcastle West, one for Roman Catholic burials, one for Presbyterian burials, and one for Wesleyan Methodist burials. Novocastrians today who are aware of the history of Newcastle may refer to these early burial grounds as either Newcastle West Cemetery, the West End Cemetery, Cottage Creek Cemetery, or Honeysuckle Point Cemetery. These burial grounds have now been completely covered by buildings or car parking, and as they were the first of Newcastle's lost cemeteries to disappear, nobody living today could ever have visited them. Christchurch was Newcastle's first and for some decades Newcastle's only burial ground, and in it were buried the earliest inhabitants of the Newcastle penal settlement. As there were no other churches until the 1840s, all denominations were interred in or near Christchurch, which came into use in 1802 with the burials of a few colliers during Dr. Mason's command, before the settlement was officially but not totally abandoned. These burials were likely informal, unsanctified, and are now completely untraceable. Between 1842 and 1858, the 3 Newcastle West cemeteries were progressively opened as clergy from other religions arrived, so from 1858 Christchurch became a holy Church of England cemetery. For anyone interested in hearing about the Christchurch burial ground, please listen to episode 2 of the Lost Cemeteries podcasts. Ian Exford's podcast on the Cathedral Church of Christ the King, more commonly known as Christchurch, is a comprehensive history of Newcastle's beautiful cathedral. Both podcasts were produced by Newcastle Family History Society. G.W. Walker wrote a history of St Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Layman Street, Newcastle, and he outlined that by 1840 there were about 50 adult Presbyterians living in Newcastle. Until their church was built, Presbyterian congregations met in private homes and later in the first courthouse in Hunter Street after it was completed in 1841. Even before November 1847, when the foundation stone of the first Presbyterian church was laid, there was pressure to acquire land for Presbyterian burials, and in January 1845, the Colonial Secretary approved a site on the land west of and beside the Roman Catholic burial ground, established 3 years earlier. At this time, Newcastle West was some distance from the main town, and the area consisted of uncleared bush and scrub and was subject to tidal inundation and flooding during heavy rain. Clearly, it was not considered a desirable location for any other type of land use. The Presbyterian and Roman Catholic cemeteries were originally located on the northern side of what is now Hunter Street, a very long street beginning almost at Newcastle Beach and eventually running directly to Maitland. While most of this road is referred to as Hunter Street, parts were once identified differently. Blaine Street was an earlier name for the western section, and even now some sections are still referred to as Hunter Street West. Closer to the location of the cemeteries, Hunter Street was once named Newcastle Street, and heading further west it becomes Maitland Road. It is this long thoroughfare that was reputedly referred to by Mark Twain as he passed through Newcastle in 1895, and these are the cemeteries that feature in quotes attributed to him. He supposedly said, "Newcastle consists of a long street with a graveyard at one end with no bodies in it, and a gentleman's club at the other with no gentlemen in it." The University of Newcastle archivist Johnny de Gravio has written a comprehensive blog about Twain and his time in Newcastle. For those wishing to learn more, search online for "Why Mark Twain Lost a Tooth in Newcastle." These two adjoining burial grounds, each measuring just under half a hectare in size, were situated west of the intersection of Hunter and Steele Streets. They lay west of the now removed Honeysuckle Point railway station, which was conveniently located to deliver bodies and mourners to funerals, and their northern boundary was the Sydney-Newcastle railway line. In July 1854, the size of the Presbyterian cemetery was reduced when a portion of land was resumed for use by the railway. The cemeteries were surrounded by a picket fence and a path ran between them. Part of the area was taken up by a caretaker's cottage. The watercourse, now known as Cottage Creek, formed the western boundary of the Presbyterian cemetery. Over the years, this creek has been variously called Cottage Creek, Swamp Creek, or Honeysuckle. At some date before 1870, the Newcastle Corporation erected a dry stone wall on the western side of the burial ground to stop any graves eroding into Cottage Creek. Early maps and some isolated photographs and paintings of these two cemeteries survive. For those attempting to locate the original Presbyterian graveyard in Newcastle today, it would lie roughly beneath the offices and car park to the east of the Cottage Creek stormwater drain. The Ibis Hotel approximately covers the site of the Roman Catholic burial ground. Presbyterian burials in Newcastle West commenced in 1844 and ended in 1881 when Sandgate Cemetery opened, and the three Newcastle West cemeteries were closed to burials. This time period encompassed the 12 years before compulsory registration commenced in 1856, and for the next 25 years from that date. Researchers from Newcastle Family History Society sourced any evidence of Presbyterian deaths for this period. In the main, three major sets of handwritten records formed the basis for the interment database: the Presbyterian Church Registers, and after 1856, civil registrations from New South Wales births, deaths and marriages, and a list of headstones. Church ministers kept the Presbyterian registers. For each burial, they generally recorded the deceased's name, age, abode, burial place and date, and an occupation. Sometimes ministers made remarks. A regular return of burial information was sent by the church to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, not all of the original Presbyterian registers have survived. A letter received in January 1999 from Antoinette Buchanan, the archivist and librarian at the Archives of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of Australia and the Presbyterian Church of Australia in the state of New South Wales, explained that the Ferguson Memorial Library held no burial records for the period until 1856. This lack of burial records was considered normal for the Presbyterian Church in New South Wales, as most ministers did not keep burial registers because burials and the ceremonies of death were not emphasised in Presbyterianism. Unfortunately, the returns to the Supreme Court for the 6 years between 1845 and 1850 which could have been helpful in filling this gap, have also not survived. Researchers therefore believe that official documentation for many burials has not survived anywhere, and only newspaper reports or information from family history researchers that is yet to come to light will add any names to the list of those interred in this cemetery before compulsory registration. The first recorded Presbyterian burial found predates the Colonial Secretary's 1845 approval to open the cemetery. It was on the 5th of November 1844 and was the burial of 23-year-old William Stewart, the son of the Presbyterian minister Robert Stewart. Contemporary newspaper sources record that the earliest surviving headstone found was that of Thomas Bruce, who was buried on the 18th of April 1846. Often it was necessary to interpret the minister's notations in the registers. One registrar recorded burial places just as Newcastle, and while the graveyard might reasonably be assumed from the denomination of the minister, it was found that many records had no officiating minister, as the deceased was buried in the presence of witnesses. These burials were likely to have been chapel or lodge ceremonies. Unless a funeral notice specified a burial location, the researchers needed to search the Christchurch burial registers or investigate the burial place of other family members in order to confirm a Presbyterian burial. There was some inconsistency using this method, as researchers found evidence that other denominations, most commonly the Wesleyans, had attempted to be buried in the Presbyterian burial ground or in Christchurch, as their burial ground was often flooded. In 1879, the Wesleyan minister, the Reverend Mr. Waterhouse, stated, "They had a cemetery of their own, but it was in a swamp, and since he had been in Newcastle, he had only buried 2 people in it." Many Wesleyans had been refused burial in the Church of England ground, so he has had to tell them to go and ask permission from the Presbyterians. In March 1856, the New South Wales government passed laws making civil registration of births, marriages and deaths compulsory. These civil registrations included greater detail about the deceased than had been recorded by the ministers. If the informant knew the information, death registrations recorded a birthplace, parents, marriage details and any children, the length of time the deceased had been in New South Wales, their cause of death, as well as the dates of their death and burial. To uncover who was buried in the Presbyterian burial ground after March 1856, the Newcastle Family History Society researchers requested support from the then Newcastle District Registrar Bob Smith, who approached the Sydney Registry Office with an outline of the project. Permission was given for researchers to access the local death registers that, in 1996, were stored in the Newcastle Registry in Wolfe Street. These registers were transferred to Sydney in 2001. There were conditions placed on this access. Only 5 fields could be extracted from the information recorded in the registers: surname, given names, the date of death, the burial place, the spouse or parents, but not both, and if neither spouse or parents were shown, which wasn't uncommon, the person's birthplace could be recorded if it appeared. The first person found to have been buried in the Presbyterian burial ground after civil registration began was 13-month-old Isabella Jack, the daughter of William and Elizabeth Jack, who died on the 12th of March 1856. The Society volunteers extracted and transcribed this information not only for the Newcastle West cemeteries, but also for the wider project aiming to reconstruct the records for all the lost burial grounds that make up this series of podcasts. In addition, the researchers checked the microfiche indexes, which may still be read at the Newcastle Family History Society Library, to ensure that the death also appeared there. Interestingly, the Newcastle office confirmed that these microfiche indexes that form the basis for the New South Wales Births, Deaths and Marriages online index that we use today were compiled from registers held in Sydney and not from the separate collection held in Newcastle. Any differences between these two sets of registers could not be compared by the researchers, and family historians should be aware of this. If they believe that a burial occurred in the Presbyterian ground in Newcastle West and there is no record of the death on the online index, it may be to their advantage to pay for a search of the Newcastle registers now held in Sydney. Interpreting and transcribing potentially damaged registers and registrations always adds a degree of difficulty when researching. Names should be recorded as they appear, but many factors contribute to spelling variations. All the records were handwritten, and even if the handwriting is clear and unfaded, and the page is complete and clean without blots or mould, there will be different interpretations of what is recorded. How did different county or country accents, speech impediments, or poor hearing affect how a name was recorded? Were those involved even literate? The handwriting of individuals varies wildly and may be particularly ornate, so interpreting individual letters may be difficult. Telling the difference between a death date and a burial date is always tricky. The information from the church and state documents formed the basis of the database of burials, and further information came from the list of headstones from the Presbyterian burial ground. Researchers found inconsistencies between these different record sets, possibly caused by illegible, weathered headstones and the sometimes difficult to interpret inscriptions transcribed nearly 100 years previously. Headstone transcriptions record the most obvious evidence of a burial, but it is important to remember that stones were paid for and erected by friends or family and not by the church. Because masonry is expensive, it is reasonably safe to say that the majority of the interments in any burial ground have no headstone, as most families could not afford the costs involved. A list of 157 headstones was compiled when the cemetery was cleared in 1916. This list may be read in the Local Studies Department of the Newcastle Regional Library and at the Newcastle Family History Society Library. This information was then cross-checked and supplemented by reports of inquests, funerals, deaths, obituaries and accidents in local and regional newspapers. Sometimes there was nothing additional located. In 1996, when this research was commenced, Trove did not exist, so each newspaper needed to be loaded onto a microfilm reader, transcribed by hand and then retyped. Many newspapers have been severely damaged by time and scissors, and some appear to have been used as working copies, so are covered with notations and marks. Despite the extensive coverage provided by contemporary publications, there are gaps where some issues have not survived. Some funeral notices were found where there was no matching death registration, so it was unknown whether the death had not been registered or if the death was registered outside the Newcastle area and the body brought here for burial. It was necessary to view, transcribe and cross-reference many records to create a final list of interments in the Newcastle West Presbyterian burial ground. By locating and collating these remaining resources, the researchers identified a total of 1,300 burials, but they found many barriers to identifying everyone buried there. Lack of records, non-registration, the occasional clandestine burial of which some evidence was found, all contributed to the problem, as finding a name if there was no burial register, civil registration, or any other evidence was impossible. The Newcastle Family History Society researchers acknowledge that many who were interred in Newcastle West may forever remain unnamed. Many of those interred in the Presbyterian burial ground were pioneers of the Newcastle area. The causes of their deaths reflect the different occupations of the people of Newcastle. There were many harbour drownings and boating and mining accidents, and each tells a very sad story. The newspapers reported on a serious accident occurring on Wombegamba, the Aboriginal name for Bullock Island, which is no longer an island and is referred to today as Carrington. One Sunday in late March 1878, William James Barty, the eldest son of John Barty, was involved in a common activity for the local boys of playing on the planks between the wharf and the various vessels in the harbour. Barty was jumping on a plank leading from the steamship Bertha to the dyke when the plank suddenly gave way and he was thrown into the water, where he hit his head on the edge of the wharf and soon died. 5 days later, William's mother, Elizabeth Barty, died, and her death was attributed to grief. As was to be expected, the town of Newcastle slowly expanded the only ways it could, south and west, slowly surrounding the Newcastle West cemeteries, and the need to establish another cemetery at some distance from the growing town became more urgent. By 1872, George Brooks was suggesting that Ironbark Hill, or the Sand Hill as it is better known, near Ironbark Creek, some 2 miles beyond Waratah, appears to be the most eligible place in the district, as no population is likely to settle down near it for generations to come. And so, after many years of debate and discussion, this location was eventually chosen. Even so, it took 9 more years before the Sandgate General Cemetery on Maitland Road began to be used. The last burial recorded in the death register for the Newcastle West Presbyterian Burial Ground was John Henry Davy, aged 1 year and 7 months, the son of John Davy and Elizabeth Ney Crooks, who drowned on the 30th of August 1881. Just over a week later, the first interment at Sandgate occurred. This was Mary Wilson Miller, the wife of John Miller, a Presbyterian, who was buried on the 10th of September 1881. Mary Wilson Miller's grave can still be viewed opposite the Sandgate Cemetery office, and it is still in a good state of preservation. After burials at Cottage Creek ended, the requirement still remained that burial grounds be maintained, but, as had occurred with all the other lost cemeteries of Newcastle, reports about the maintenance or the lack thereof of the burial grounds frequently appeared in the papers. There were complaints about the neglected, overgrown condition of the graveyard, so it is hardly surprising that large snakes were reported in the area. As time passed, the situation worsened, and parts of the Presbyterian cemetery were so overgrown that many graves were completely hidden from view. Time took its toll, and the wooden railings on graves rotted and needed repairs, and the paling fence had to be replaced. Upkeep was expensive and time-consuming, and each church now had to maintain their burial grounds at Newcastle West, as well as their new graves at Sandgate. It was eventually proposed to resume the adjoining Roman Catholic and Presbyterian cemeteries near Cottage Creek and put the land to other uses. Newcastle Council was keen to have the cemeteries removed as they were considered an eyesore, but also because they could then charge rates on the land. Early discussion about clearing the cemetery did not include any discussion about exhumations. There was some community protest, as it was considered that a clearance disturbed the resting place of the dead and was almost an act of desecration. Finally, after an earlier revocation in December 1904, the dedication of the Presbyterian burial ground was permanently revoked on the 11th of December 1907. There was then some disagreement about who should pay to exhume the bodies, and it was questioned whether the Presbyterian Church not only had enough money to do this, but whether their funds should be spent in that way. This led to discussion regarding funding to support the costs for individual families to move their deceased relatives. Evidence remains that some of the costs for exhumations and transfer of remains to Sandgate were borne by some individual families, but in the main costs were covered in an Act of Parliament in August 1916. A contract was let by the Newcastle Public Works Department for the exhumation of both the Presbyterian and the Roman Catholic graves, and for the transfer of the graves and remains to Sandgate Cemetery. The Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate reported that, in the removal of the remains from the cemeteries, the utmost care will be exercised, and the department states that this will be stipulated in the conditions. The operations, furthermore, will not be open to the gaze of the curious. A temporary high fence will be erected to shut out the now open portion from public view. It is the desire of the department to observe every care for the preservation of all that remains of the dead, and to attain this end they will be placed in new coffins. Every precaution is to be taken for the correct identification, as far as possible, of the remains, which, upon their removal to their new resting place, will be accompanied by the headstones, railings, etc. It was further reported that these exhumations and reinterments were undertaken methodically and carefully over a period of a couple of months at the end of 1916. The Newcastle Family History Society researchers found nothing to ascertain how Public Works identified any burial sites, and they could only assume that it was the evidence of any remaining headstones, railings, hollows, or mounds which suggested where to dig. Headstones, side stones, and railings were transferred to Sandgate, and the bodies were recoffined. Accounts of the exhumations suggest that in many cases little of the contents of the original honeysuckle grave remained to recoffin or bury. In some of the graves, chiefly graves which had no stone or any other means of identification, there were no remains of either a coffin or a body. Sometimes the coffin had decayed, leaving only a few bones. The number of graves exhumed totalled about 160. The list of headstones compiled in 1916 identified 157 stones, and the researchers believe that as this number roughly approximates to the number of exhumations, it represents remains relocated from the Presbyterian burial ground to Sandgate Cemetery. In the main, the Presbyterian graves, some potentially with a body, were reinterred in the area to the left of the second access gate at Sandgate. When it is considered that only about 160 graves and bodies were removed from the Newcastle West Presbyterian ground, this represents a rather paltry fraction of the total number buried and suggests that more than 1,100 graves may not have been exhumed and still lie in the ground at Newcastle West beside Cottage Creek. In the intervening years, all trace of the Presbyterian and the adjoining Roman Catholic burial grounds to the east has disappeared. Over time, various buildings, including a motor showroom and maintenance workshop, and various small shops were erected over the unexhumed bodies. When the research into the Newcastle West burials commenced in 1996, most of these businesses were derelict and awaiting the redevelopment of the area. The Honeysuckle Development Corporation was charged with revitalising the Newcastle foreshore and environs, and today, over 25 years later, artwork, parks and walkways have been constructed in the Newcastle West area, with pedestrian bridges crossing Cottage Creek, now constrained in a stormwater drain. This area is becoming an increasingly beautiful part of the Honeysuckle recreational area that fronts Newcastle Harbour, although there is little to no signage to indicate to those unfamiliar with the area of what still lies beneath their feet. In undertaking the research to reconstruct the burial records of this and other graveyards, researchers were mindful of the interests of family and local historians, and also of the heritage value of the cemeteries. The lost cemetery sites have been investigated at great length and are an important part of the history of Newcastle. Many of those who laboured and guarded during the convict era were potentially interred in the Newcastle West burial grounds and are long since forgotten. Humble though many undoubtedly were, They were the builders of this city, no matter their status, no matter their misdemeanours, or whether their lives were short or long. The information compiled to help to understand the Presbyterian burial ground has been painstakingly researched, checked and rechecked by the research team using whatever original records, with all their shortcomings, remained. As time passes, it is possible that new information may be uncovered as an interest in family history has caused descendants to further investigate their origins. Should any individual researcher locate evidence within their personal documents about any family or person interred in this or in any other of Newcastle's cemeteries, please let Newcastle Family History Society know. Opportunities to learn of the fate of the deceased or to assist in further understanding Newcastle's history are always welcomed.
Newcastle Family History Society hopes that we have aided your understanding of this inner city burial ground and the history of the area in which it is located. We should always remember that there are many who may never be known, and sadly there will remain forever some undiscovered and unrecorded burials of those interred in the Newcastle West Presbyterian Cemetery. Whether obscure or famous, everyone deserves to be remembered. The result of the research of Newcastle Family History Society, recording the history of each of the 3 Newcastle West cemeteries and identifying the names of those interred there, may be found in our Newcastle West Burial Grounds publication. This is available from our online shop in book form and soon will be released as a download, so please visit the NFHS website if you're interested in investigating further. For more in this Lost Cemeteries series, join Jane Ison next month when she'll look at the Roman Catholic burial ground in Newcastle West on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.